Hello there, and welcome to Masters of Influence. It's just me today. Joe is out and about doing his own thing, but I'm here and here to talk about power and the use of power and how we can use power more effectively, how we can identify power out in the world, and maybe put up a few defenses against it. And today, I want to focus on the control of information and specifically the control of context. It's been very interesting with this shooting in Minneapolis, how the different news outlets and the different positions have grabbed on to different pieces of video to demonstrate their point. And I think that that really gets at something fundamental around how we understand what's going on and how we can control what one another believes by setting the context. But to get at how this works, I want to go back to 1920, as one does, to the Kuleshov experiment. Lev Kuleshov was a Soviet filmmaker in the early 1920s. Now, the 1920s, early 20th century, this was a time when people were really experimenting with film and trying to figure out how to convey information. A few years before we brought AI into the picture, but they're trying to understand how they can convey emotion, how they can convey a part of a scene. I think we take a lot of that for granted today, but at the time, they didn't know. They didn't know how people would interpret film because it hadn't ever been done before. So what he did was he took a single shot of an actor's completely expressionless face, and he spliced that face together with different images. And he did this back before digital, right? That was when they actually had to cut the film. One was a bowl of soup. Another was a child in a coffin. And the third was a woman on a divan. And he showed this to audiences to see how they would react to the image. What did the image convey when it was surrounded by these other objects? Because this was a neutral face. It wasn't conveying anything intentionally. It was just trying to be neutral. And importantly, it wasn't actually taken with these different items, right? He just copied it onto an image with that item. And when he showed it to the audiences, they swore that the actor looked hungry when paired with the soup, grief stricken when paired with the coffin, and amorous when paired with the woman, even though the shot of his face never changed. Now, the experiment showed that viewers were not reading emotion from the face alone, but that they were taking information and constructing emotion out of the sequences, letting the surrounding shots tell them what the face must mean. The meaning of the actor's expression existed not in his features, and not in how he was presenting his face, but in the context of the shot. What this meant was that an editor could take something that was one way, it could take something that was neutral and create a context around it that would significantly influence how audiences interpreted that thing. And we've all seen visual illusions where given one suggestion, we see something, given another suggestion, we see something else. And here is a example of that, where you look at this figure and you see A, B, C. But what's interesting is when you change the context and you remove the A and the C, and you turn those to 12 and 14, the B looks like a 13. And you wouldn't have even thought of the B as a 13 with the ABC. And it doesn't look at all like a B with the 12, 13, 14. The context is completely determinant of our opinion as to whether it's a 13 or whether it's a B. Philosophers will tell us that we can't possibly understand what's happening without context. We have to get the context of any action in order to understand what's actually going on. Is something defense or is it aggression? Is somebody running out of fear or running for fitness? You can't know without understanding the context. Understanding the why matters. Understanding the broader picture matters. And the narrower we get on something, the more we eliminate the context, the more we control the meaning. Because we define that context. We can wrap it with whatever we want to say so that whatever we see means what we want it to mean, or what somebody else wants it to mean for us. And this isn't just a theoretical thing that's happening only in the US. We can think of this in a much broader context, if you will. And one example, almost a classic at this point, is the 2017 ethnic cleansing in Myanmar. So that situation demonstrates how the conflict there erupted in August of 2017 during a period of actually relative optimism in Myanmar. While racial tensions at the time existed, Rohingya and Buddhist communities had, for the most part, coexisted peacefully. But in 2016, 2017, a small separatist group calling itself the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army carried out several attacks with the aim of establishing a Muslim state in Myanmar. So they killed and abducted dozens of non-Muslim citizens in something that was an action that was unequivocally bad. The response in this case targeted the entire Rohingya population. There's another angle to this context removal. In 2011, a researcher named Dana Boyd described how persistent, visible, separable, and searchable public networks collapse the different social contexts within which we live. So traditionally, we present different versions of ourselves to our boss and our friends. We share different information with family versus colleagues. We play in the back of the bus when no one is looking, and that doesn't necessarily make us bad people who can't follow the rules. But public networks and public communication collapse that context. In her words, public and private become meaningless binaries. And you can see how this public-private affects people, affects probably your life. It certainly has affected mine. What you say publicly, what you say privately now becomes something public, and it's very difficult to actually control those different narratives. And now you look at how people are latching on to something that was said in this realm, taken into that realm, something that somebody did over here is something meaningful over there. All of these contexts are being smushed together into everything you say, everything you do, every action you take is open for interpretation based on my context rather than where you were or what you were doing. And that can be very difficult for us as human beings. It can be very difficult for how we are perceived in the actions that we take, in how people understand some of the things that we do, the jokes that we tell, for example. But it can also become really problematic when we look at the shooting of Nicole Good in Minneapolis. And we come to the control of context. In the first place we see the control of context is with the federal government disallowing local investigations. They come up with all kinds of reasons why the locals shouldn't investigate this. Why? Because they want to control the context, they want to control the narrative so that they can control the actions taken in support of or against their officers. And then they actively, aggressively go out without evidence and start setting the context. This is what happened. This is what was going on. We start to get stories of aggressiveness and how she's being aggressive and how she's doing terrible things and what type of a person she is. We try and define her in terms that will make the situation look like she was doing something wrong. And this is all an attempt to control the context so that they control the meaning of the event, so that they control how we understand the event. So, in case you haven't seen what's happening there, let me paint a picture. So, Nicole is in her car. The car is more or less perpendicular to the flow of traffic. And we don't know why. There's no information why. So, there's one piece of context that's missing. And she's in the car motioning for people to go around her. And then ICE officers pull up, they stop. One of them starts to approach the driver's side. And then one of them takes his camera and starts to film all the way around the car. And as he's getting all the way around the car, she starts to pull away. He jumps a little bit to the side and then he starts firing, shooting Nicole Good and killing her. What's happened is that we have lots of different narratives based on all of the different perspectives. We have a million different perspectives because so many people were filming at the same time. So we have lots of cell phone cameras showing lots of different angles. And the moment of contention is that moment when she turns and the guy's on the corner of her car. And the question is, does she hit him or does she not hit him? Now, from many different perspectives, it's pretty clear that she doesn't hit him. He steps out of the way as she's turning, and as he's stepping, he pulls the trigger. But there's one video, and that's the video in which he's actually holding the camera, where it looks like maybe he is being hit by the car. So he's going around and the video begins to jostle and there's a loud sound and people say, well, this is evidence that he was hit by the car.
Get out of the car. Get out of the car.
But in fact, when you sync that video up with other videos, with other perspectives, you can see that the reason the phone is being jostled is because he's shooting a gun at the driver. She doesn't actually hit him at all. But what's happened is partisan or biased perspectives have latched on to that video as evidence that Good was attacking ICE and that Good was attacking this officer and that she had hit him and he was firing in self-defense. And like I say, if you look at lots of different videos and lots of different perspectives, you can see that that's really blatantly not true. But it doesn't matter that it's not true if that's all that you see. If what you see is a neutral expression with a bowl of soup, you are going to think that that expression makes the person look hungry. If all you see is this guy walking around and all of a sudden the phone jostles and you hear a loud noise, you're going to think that he got hit by the car. And if someone wants to influence you and make sure that you see what they want you to see, they're not going to show you the other angles, the angles that disagree with that particular shot. And this is where we are in our discourse today, where we are controlling information for one another by collapsing context, by taking things out of context. Something that you might have said privately becomes public. Something that you might have said public is a private issue. where we look at one angle of the film versus another angle and show how it tells the story that we want it to tell rather than the story that is. And this is only going to get worse with AI, where we can adjust the image to make it look just like the way that we want it to look. Context is crucial. And a key lever of power is to understand and manipulate context to make sure that you don't see the full picture. So, how do we know that the context is being set for us? In some ways, we don't. There are some situations in which we have to just be cognizant of the fact that context may be manipulated. But typically, what you can see is that as things become narrower, context gets squeezed out. So the narrower something is, the more controlled the viewing, the more likely context is being manipulated. In this situation, you can look at 5 angles at once, or you can look at one angle. And when you look at one angle, the context is being controlled. When you look at 5 angles, you can probably assume that context is being opened up, or there's an attempt to bring context to the story. So we should always be skeptical of those points, of those stories where context is being manipulated, where we can easily identify that context is being manipulated. And it doesn't mean that we can't use those as sources of information, but we have to understand the manipulation of context. We have to be skeptical of the manipulation of context, or we're always going to be driven by what somebody else wants us to understand. Now, I like to go back to Robert Greene's laws of power. I think it's sort of interesting to use that as a framework. And if I go back to Robert Greene's laws of power, where does this control of context actually fit in? And there are a couple of ways. There's the conceal your intentions. Well, you can conceal your intentions only if you can frame the narrative around your actions. Or then there's Law 27, create a cult-like following that requires you to construct an entire interpretive framework for your followers. That is essentially setting the context. Now, Law 32 is play to other people's fantasies, is literally about building alternative contexts that people find more appealing than reality itself. Now, underneath all of these is that idea of context. And I don't think Green truly states context setting as a rule. So maybe we should add one. And we should add the idea of define the frame before entering the arena. So he who controls the context controls not just the interpretation of events, but the very possibility of what counts as evidence. If you own the channel, if you own the means of communication, if you own the story, you can determine not just how the evidence is interpreted, but what constitutes evidence? What counts as evidence? What is legitimate evidence? You present it because you own the context. And whereas we may or may not be able to own our own contexts, we can be aware of those who are owning the contexts around us. I think we get a little bit confused by bias and the idea of bias. And I remember that The Economist used to put their bias right at the beginning of the magazine, because the idea was you can understand what we're saying and interpret it within any environment as long as you understand our bias. Understanding bias is fine. It's fine to have a bias. Context is something different. When you completely remove the context, when you don't even when you don't even talk about what your bias is, when you don't even disclose that there is a bias, then you are taking actions to control people's interpretation of events. You're not just reporting, you're not just communicating, you are trying to control, you are exerting power. And we can see this exertion of power around us the entire time. And our obligation is to recognize that, stand up against it, and try to set our own contexts. So that's what we have today for Masters of Influence. I hope you found it interesting. I'd love to know what you think of context and what you've observed around good shooting or anything else. And maybe we'll talk about it next time right here on Masters of Influence.